Anton is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. He holds a chair in institutional policy analysis and he holds a doctorate in political science from Oxford University. His latest book is Changing Welfare States, and he will be speaking on the topic 21st Century European Social Investment Imperatives.
I'm going to talk about affordable, given the crisis, social investment as a no-regret policy. And I think it's good to start with the following. I published indeed a book with OUP earlier this year. It's called Changing Welfare States. And in one of the chapters, I make a distinction between three phases of welfare state development across Europe. And what is important to highlight here is that the post-war welfare state, as we know it, was the outgrowth of the Great Depression and the Second World War. And I'm a policy analyst, so I position myself always somehow emphatically in the feet of policymakers. And so if you think about, after the Great Depression and the Second World War, what was on the minds of policymakers? What did they want most? And use all the tools and intellectual capacity that was around to achieve it. Then that was the search for stability. The period of the 1920s and 1930s was so chaotic, and it ended in a war. So, how to stabilize the economy, the polity, society was on the minds of policymakers. And these policymakers were helped by important figures, and not only Keynes and Beveridge, but with Keynes and Beveridge, there was somehow this idea that if you develop a buffer in terms of social insurance, then when the cycle goes down, you can use that buffer as a way to stabilize effective demand. So there was a very happy affinity between Keynes and Beveridge, and this approach to the expansion of the welfare state until the 1960s into the 1970s was hugely successful. In terms of growth, in terms of full employment, in terms of social protection, in terms of equalization of income. And in a way it was too successful because then came the oil shocks of the 1970s and early 1980s, and this was not, the Great Depression was, of course, as we know, a financial crisis. The 1970s and 1980s crisis was really a real economy crisis, and in part, talking about causes, in part the welfare state was also part of the cause of the crisis, in the sense that we've made this search for stability, we went a little bit overboard in all kinds of social protection schemes, benefits at very high level for extended periods of time, wage indexation system, and so have you. So policymakers, lo and behold, not in the 1970s, has repeated the message of the 1930s, wrongly so, but only in the 1980s we shifted to institutional liberalization, to liberalize the welfare state, to retrench the welfare state, not dismantle it, but really to do a number of things, whether you like it or not. But this became the new dominant theory, that whenever there's a problem, you liberalize. So before we have the great financial shock of late, there was already in the sort of social policy area, in my own kind of thinking, this idea that the old welfare state with the Keynesian buffers, there are problems with it, but the new sort of retrenched, deregulated models were also not really resilient enough to deal with changes, especially changes in the family, the feminization of the labor market in particular, and also with respect to age, a significant problem. And I started writing in the early 2000s, together with Just Asping Andersen, a very famous scholar, on why we need a new welfare state. And this new welfare state we defined in terms of social investment terms. And the idea was not to compensate ex post for economic misfortune, but to really start thinking ex ante, to invest in human capabilities over the life cycle. And the most important issues then were to organize the flow of labor market input of families over the life cycle. And to organize the flow, I mean, what is central there is work-family reconciliation policy that allow women to enter the labor market, perhaps with the provision of very good childcare, that you can already start the education career of children at a young age, and that has a long-term knock-on effect in terms of employment and productivity. And to raise the human capital stock throughout the life course as well. So the stock and flow. And I think what the crisis taught us, the most recent crisis, is that again it's a financial crisis. So we keep applying the policy recipes of the 1980s, and I think you have to stand back and think this is a different kind of crisis. And in a way, what is interesting to see that actually these sort of Keynesian, Beveridgean buffers actually worked quite well. I mean, much better in Europe than in the US, and much better in the advanced welfare states of Europe than in the southern welfare states. So the imperative is not one of flexibility, is a little bit one of stability but is more one of what I would like to call resilience. Now, there are all these background factors, global economic internationalization. I think what is really important is the changes that have been going on within our families. And there's one thing that I would like to highlight is that under current conditions where the EU has become so important and that national welfare states are no longer autonomous, they're semi-sovereign, that there is this rise of sort of national welfare chauvinism all across Europe, and I think this is politically quite dangerous, and we're going to see some of this happening in the European elections. The big point in my book is that welfare states have changed tremendously over the past 30 years. I mean, there's many scholars that sometimes reason that it's very difficult to have elephants dance. Well, if you look back from a 3-decade period, I mean, we've seen quite a bit of a dancing of elephants in a way, and this is. So there is a converging story here, and it's about cost-competitive wage moderation, the sobering up of social insurance with more activation conditionality applied to it, more spending on active labor market policy, dual earner family support, childcare. Human capital has been rediscovered as really a key asset of rich democracies. And an element of financial hybridization. And what is interesting to see, there's a shift in the financing of social insurance to taxation, and also with more private contributions. This we've seen in Ireland, we've seen in the Netherlands, we've seen in Germany at different times, at different places. So, I mean, in this respect, the sort of the shift to this more supply-side oriented macroeconomic policy and EMU really performed as a convergence machine the way it was meant to be. But then, something happened and was only revealed within the crisis. And if you look at sort of different models of welfare states, you can see that the Nordics, they've really shifted towards social investments, fiscally robust, dual earner model. The continental countries are sort of halfway there, but they've been able to overcome some of their big unemployment problems. I mean, in Germany especially, but also in the Netherlands and Austria, less so in Belgium and France. And it's interesting to see how the Anglo-Irish pair shifted towards social investment in the good times, but then when the crisis hit, they started to retrench again because of quite significant elements of private debt overhang. And I think in that respect, I mean, Ireland is also, or rather, I have to put it differently, that the Netherlands is a bit like Ireland as well. You also see the shift towards social investment, and then quite significant cuts in the recent period, which goes to show that the Netherlands is a very different type of economy than the German economy today. But that's not the key divergence. The key divergence are the Mediterranean countries in a way. And what happened there is that as they entered EMU, real interest rates dropped tremendously. And on the entry of EMU, there were a lot of sort of, pension reforms also going into to do this convergent direction. But as soon as they were confronted with very low interest rates, and given the fact that the European Commission only at the time, today it's different luckily, at the time only targeted inflation, deficit and growth, there was no pressure on them to continue the reform of the labor market, the reform of education systems, and so on and so forth. And this led to this massive current account deficit divergence. And then came the sovereign debt crisis in Greece, and then there was a big panic all across Europe, and policymakers decided to step on the brake on fiscal policy, which made the situation worse and which even threatened to undermine EMU. And we're in this situation, or we're slowly getting out of the situation. But in the meantime, I think accidents can happen. If we look at the good years before the crisis, what drives everything, I think, is employment. It's interesting to see that on top you see Sweden. It had a financial crisis in the late 1980s, so it dropped tremendously. But ever since 2000, you see this upward trend of employment population ratio. So that's the good news. Behind that, is a secular picture of high levels of female activity. And again, you see this converging trend. And I think what is crucial to understand the changes of society that somehow don't enter in our econometric models is that today the participation rate of women across Europe is positively correlated with fertility rates. And what this means is that young people decide to have children once they have secured their position in the labor market. And that's very important to realize. And of course, 3 decades ago and 4 or 5 decades ago, this correlation was the exact opposite. So there's been a major transformation in our society that we have to reckon with, especially today, as we are aging. So, there is a baby crunch happening across Europe, and this is going to worsen the pension problem that we are already facing because of aging. The other good news is higher participation rates of older workers, and here you see again Sweden on top, followed by the UK. And what is special with these countries, in fact, is that they actually spend on average more on lifelong learning policies. So lifelong learning policy really pay off in higher levels of participation of older workers. And education pays off. I mean, there's really hardly any difference across Europe in terms of people employed. This is all before the crisis. When it comes to tertiary education, the differences are in the medium-skilled jobs and the low-skilled jobs. But even there, the richest welfare states, the Scandinavian ones, perform better in terms of getting the low-skilled into jobs. And given the fact that the European Commission is only slowly going to look at the real economy in terms of the important indicators, I mean, here you see a tremendous failure of skill formation systems in the southern countries. And we talk a lot about employment protection, that we still need to flexibilize the labor market. I mean, it's happening. There's a convergent trend, but that doesn't really tell you the differences across countries. And then there's a lot of talk about inequality, the Gini coefficient, and what we do see that although we've created so many jobs, there is, in terms of fighting poverty, is somehow a sort of a standstill. We haven't been able to create the jobs so that we also have to lower, we're able to lower relative poverty. So, what are the main trends? Upward, again, before the crisis, upward employment convergence. Employment today is the largest source of the incomes of families. You probably need 2 jobs these days. At risk of poverty standstill, which goes to show that with this activation, maybe there's an erosion of the redistributive capacity of the welfare state. Top incomes are pulling away from the middle. And polarization, I think this is the new social question, polarization of work rich versus work poor households. I'm going to go to this picture because it needs some explaining. And let me preface that this is changing. This is an ideal type. So then came the crisis, and I don't have to list the poverty increases, the employment increases. It has already been done in the previous session. But this is a condition. At crisis, there's a lot of what Herbert Simon used to call bounded rationality. So policymakers don't know where to pull, and they need a background theory in their heads to say, okay, this is what we best do. And given the fact that over the past 3 decades, without being critical, because I think the neoliberal epoch did bring many good things, lower inflation, constrained budgets, etc., etc. But if you apply the lesson of the 1980s to the crisis of 2008, maybe you're fighting in the wrong corner. That's more my point. So what is the default theory? What is the idea of policymakers over the past 3 decades in most of our country? The basic policy problem, the way it's been defined, especially in terms of aging, is cost containment. And if the policy problem is cost containment, then you have to somehow, from this perspective, engineer a risk shift to the private sphere, as if the aging problem goes away. Of course it doesn't. It's just that we as families will have to pay for our fathers and mothers, and the question is whether that's sufficient. But nevertheless, then it's off the public books. And the way this is legitimized in terms of policy theory is that that inevitably there's a trade-off between equity and efficiency. So whatever the whatever the state does in terms of social policy or education policy or leave and childcare policy, it crowds out private economic initiative on the assumption that welfare states have this sort of moral hazard problem, and capital markets do not have a moral hazard problem. Today we know better, but that's again, this is a theory. So then the policy instrumentation is really to try to deregulate and retrench in order to engineer this risk shift from the public to the private. And the macro policy that you need that sort of constrains governments to do the right thing is being very tough on the Stability and Growth Pact and the Fiscal Pact and what have you, so that governments don't go over the books. And thinking about government and thinking about institution, the idea is you really need to take out all market barriers, and sometimes trade unions can be market barriers, and sometimes employer organization they pamper the insiders. So these are distributive coalitions that you really somehow have to constrain, and basically governments can do no good because if the government has an important rate of return, then private capital would have already discovered it. So it's, from this perspective, it's very questionable whether you should have a public education system rather than a private education system. And the political discourse, nicely phrased by Mario Draghi a year ago, is that the European social model is dead, and that in fact the crisis proves this. So this is a coherent theory from which you can do certain policy interventions. And again, policymakers don't know what they're up to, but they need a theory to approach real problems. You can have a different approach, and I think what I try to show in my book, that there's the empirical record of this different approach is very, very strong. And this is one which thinks about returns from investments, whether they're public or private. And the idea is to raise revenue. And the way to raise revenue is, as I've showed before the crisis, is to maximize employment in the open economy. And it's been shown that if you do social investments, childcare policy, parental leave policy, this raises employment in terms of flow, but it raises also employment in terms of stock. It is a supply side strategy, I must admit. So the thinking of when you think about instrumentation is to really try to mitigate these life cycle contingencies of frail elderlies, of bringing up young children, reconciling work and family life through thinking about long-term stock, the flow, and the universal buffers that we need and that we also were able to enact again in the crisis. And moving to the macro side, economic stabilization is much more than fighting inflation and making sure that deficits are going down. And institutions, trade unions, they're not only distributive coalitions. They can be productive coalition, the way the Irish economy has shown before. And there is a political payoff in this perspective as well, that you can actually have a discourse of capacitating and caring solidarity. I'll finish with one thing. What is interesting, what I'm thinking about right now, reasoning from these two ideal types, that clearly when we go through the sequencing of policy responses to the crisis, what we saw in 2008 is fire brigade Keynesianism to save the financial sector with some flanking social investment measures. Then, on the sovereign debt crisis of Greece, there is a shift to intrusive austerity everywhere, also in countries that did quite well, such as Germany, which then sort of further undermined the competitive positions of the countries that didn't do so well. And that as of 2012, we slowly see a shift in direction away from austerity, using social indicators, scoreboards, the way Istvan talked about this morning. There's now also a new discussion on the social dimension of EMU. But my problem with that is the following, and that's where I want to end. The problem with that is that these are all lists. These are, they're good indicators. The need indicator, neither in employment nor in training of youngsters, that's very important to look at. But what does it do in terms of policy? And I think that these things start to make sense if you take a more social investment policy theory to it, and then you can show that actually, if you retrench quite strongly the way we do it, and we may be loosening this, I read it this morning in the newspaper as well, is that you kill off productive capacity in the long run. And sort of the irony could be, this doesn't apply to Ireland because you have a different demographic profile, but the irony could be that you will reach full employment sooner rather than later. But that's going to be very poor full employment, because now there will be a lost generation whose then will be very difficult to reintegrate in the labor market. So the pool of labor gets smaller, so thereby you get full employment. And then, of course, the trade unions will then start to raise wages, and you go from the current crisis into something that looks like the 1980s, which is a stagflation crisis. So it's very important, given the demographic dynamics and the social dynamics that go on in Europe right now, to really start to think about a different way to have fiscal consolidation alongside long-term social investments. And what I read in the newspaper today, which is sort of like an idea that I flagged 2 years ago, is that you have conditional fiscal consolidation reforms. By which I mean that if Spain suggests to put extra money into their flawed education system, then they can take a slower pace in the structural reforms of their, let's say, their pension system. And this will help youngsters. And I think that Merkel is today agreeing. So the interesting thing is that, there are these two theories. They're both being sort of endorsed in different quarters. And there is a recognition we need to move more towards thinking about raising revenues than only thinking about cost containment, although cost containment is, of course, very important. Thanks very much.